psychoneuroendocrinologist. Sorry, I'm not a medical doctor. I'm biochemist by background, so all these terms and titles are difficult for me. But Dr. Edwards is an expert in how to handle patients with chronic disease, especially with pain as their main symptoms, focusing on Black people and other minorities communication. And Dr. Edwards, I see that you are here online, so thank you so much for joining. I hope that the techniques also will let us hear you.
Good morning, Madrid. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you perfectly.
Good.
So, please go ahead and share all your knowledge with us.
That's fantastic. Thank you. I'm honored to be able to chat with you for just a few minutes this morning on the topic of subject ascertainment, particularly for hematological trials. We presented this at the Philadelphia meeting, and I think it went pretty well, and I'm hoping that we can do the same today, answering many of your questions related to obstacles to effective subject recruitment. Next slide, please. I would be remiss if I did not indicate all of the individuals, and this is certainly not the extensive list, but this is certainly a list of the individuals who helped me organize and put this presentation together. Most are my students, and I'm always glad to help train the next generation to replace me. I'm soon going to retire for the second time, and I hope to do it better the second time than I did it the first time. Next slide. So one of the places I believe that is important to begin when assessing your capacity for subject ascertainment is by understanding the historical context for what you're trying to do. And that is understanding that no matter what country you go to, there have been individuals who have marred and who have engaged the community in a manner that makes your work today more difficult. Next slide. I charged my staff with going to each country listed in the trial and finding me some of the material that the community would know about, whether we knew about it or not. And that is really beginning to understand in each of the countries that this trial is being done, what are the historical atrocities that the community will have knowledge of and access to that may contaminate the environment in which you are trying to recruit. And certainly in Great Britain, we found the Bristol heart scandal in the 1990s. We know that in that trial, 35 children died. Mortality rates were exceptionally high. There were issues of informed consent. There were issues of transparency. There really were a number of problems with the study, and it certainly is one that contaminates research recruitment in Great Britain. Next slide, please. Similarly to Great Britain, we found issues in Greece. There were trials and medical processes that illegally recruited individuals for organ trafficking. And it really was a big deal. There were forced medical experiments on prisoners in the 1960s and 1970s. what I want you seeing as we go through each of these countries is that no country really has a license on atrocities in the community, that every country has had some difficulty, and that is always going to make your work more difficult. Next slide, please. In Italy, we found, again, the same sort of issues, issues with eugenics, with forced sterilization, issues with thalidomide studies that produced horrible birth outcomes and birth defects. We recognize that one of the more well-known studies was the Northwick Park clinical trial. 6 volunteers ended up with substantial organ failure and premature death as the result of exposure to a particular molecule, TGN 1412, that was in clinical trials. What I hope you are beginning to see is that no country is left unmarred by research atrocities. Next slide. Similarly, in India, we had the same sort of issues going on. There were issues of inappropriate experimentation with prisoners where informed consent was not achieved, not given, where individuals did not have the right to withdraw, where their medical care and the line of research was blurred substantially, where physicians were not clearly identified as researchers, and they recruited individuals into their trials for the purpose of engaging them in research without giving them all of the rights that are required today for someone to participate in research, including informed consent. Next slide. Collectively, I want you to see that we could go on literally for days in articulating research atrocities, in articulating country by country, trial by trial, the atrocities that have been committed on the community. And I say on the community because it is in that exact community that you are now attempting to recruit. Next slide. One of the responses that you sometimes get, particularly in the U.S., as it relates to requesting a person's participation in trials, is that I am not going to be your guinea pig. And that simply references the idea that I'm not trusting of what you tell me. I'm not trusting that there is a distinction between what you are doing clinically and what you are doing in terms of a clinical trial. It is about mistrust, and 3 studies that I think around the world that really are the hallmark of that mistrust are listed here on the screen for you. The Tuskegee syphilis study is one where men were withheld a viable treatment for syphilis over many years for the purpose of engaging a clinical trial on syphilis. One of the notable things I want you to recognize about the Tuskegee study is that they hired a black nurse. White male researchers hired a black nurse to go into the black community and recruit men to stay into the study. Specifically, she worked diligently to make sure that men didn't go to other clinics where they knew a antibiotic could be provided that would cure syphilis. She worked diligently to make sure that men did not get knowledge and insight and informed consent for their participation. She worked diligently to make sure that men did not have a choice. And that is important because we sometimes believe, as we'll talk about shortly, that hiring a representative from the community that you're working with is the answer. And what I am going to say to you is you have to do more than that. The community is often immune to many of the techniques that we use to solicit and keep them in clinical trials. In South Africa in the 70s, the Aversion Project was another project that really marred the landscape for subsequent research. The trial was one that attempted to convert homosexual men to heterosexual men. And what the trial did was connect men to a penile plethysmograph, which is a device that detects an erection or tension in the penis, and it also connected the men's penis to an electrical device. Men were shown pictures of naked men, and when they got an erection, they were shocked. They were shocked in their genital areas, often to the point that they were burned. There is one noted case, when you look at the Aversion Project, where a man was shocked with such wattage and voltage that his shoes were knocked off by the process. Men were scarred, men were impacted, and they were shocked until they no longer had erections via a naked man. And when they began having erections to naked women, they were considered cured. You would think that that was the worst of the Aversion Project, but it's not. Men were assumed to be transgender and were given sex change operations. It was of interest because many men were gay but not transgender. It is also of interest that when the trial ended, men were no longer able to get the estrogen treatments that prevented their voices from being deepened, that prevented their facial hair from growing, that prevented their masculinity setting in. And so what I want you to know about the Aversion trial is that when the trial ended, all benefits to the subjects ended in a way that was detrimental to their health and their investment into the clinical trial. In Turkey, there was an episode, a trial that was actually done as part of a clinical intervention at the hospital listed here. I am not smart enough to pronounce that particular hospital, but you may do so yourselves. It is notable because the conditions inside the hospital were deplorable. The conditions inside the hospital were such that there were multiple individuals sleeping in the same bed. A trial on mental illness was given or conducted, and what is notable about this trial is the impact that it left on the community. The impact was one where individuals recognized that they were not valued as a participant in a trial, that their mental health acceptability made them less than human, made them less than an animal, and they were treated as such. The conditions inside the hospital were worse than what you would see in any animal lab today. What I want you leaving this historical section understanding is that in the very brief recitation I've given you, you can tell that no matter where you go in the world, no matter what country you go to, research has often been contaminated by those who had good ideas. They often had great intentions, but their behavior and their execution of processes during the trial was less than that to be desired. Next slide, please. All of this becomes important because what we recognize is an assumption of homogeneity across individuals as it relates to pain is inappropriate. That individuals vary as a function of gender, as a function of race and ethnicity, as a function of socioeconomics and culture. They vary in how they respond to pain, how they manifest pain, how they rate or don't rate pain, how they report or don't report pain. Very early in my career, I wrote a paper that you see on the screen now, Race, Ethnicity, and Pain. And I wrote it really just across a couple of days to reaffirm what I thought everyone already knew. And that is simply that pain varies across individuals, and that race is one of the demographic factors that pain varies across. To my surprise, once the paper came out, it came out in the context of a large, vast number of individuals not understanding that simple principle. There have been and continue to be assumptions of homogeneity, that if you understand one population, you understand them all. And what I want you to know is that is not true. Next slide, please. Early in my career, too, I was asked to participate on a study as an investigator where we took a major journal, Psychosomatic Medicine, and we simply evaluated every study that had been done in the area of chronic pain since the inception of the journal in the 1940s. Next slide. To my absolute surprise, we will talk about this graph. What I want you to see on this graph, if you'll go to the legend at the bottom, I'd like for you to go across to race, ethnicity, and culture. And I want you to see, based on the legend on the right, that in the 1940s, there was not a single paper that was written on the topic of race, ethnicity, and culture. I want you to see that in the 1950s, not a single paper was written on the topic of race, ethnicity, and culture as it related to chronic pain. I want you to see that in the 1960s, not a single paper was published in a major medical journal on the topic of race, ethnicity, and culture as it relates to chronic pain. In the 1970s, there was a 200% increase in the number of papers produced. And that is simply to say, there were 2 papers published in the decade of the 1970s. It's apparent that one of those investigators died because in the 1980s, there was only 1 paper produced. In the 1990s, there were 8 papers produced. What I want you to understand from this particular graph is that today we are in our infancy in terms of knowledge about blacks and other disenfranchised populations as it relates to race, ethnicity, pain, and culture. It is the case that you will see that many other populations, for example, studies on women, follow a very similar pattern. Diversity really has not been a word that applies at all to research in the area of chronic pain. Next slide, please. I want you to understand from what we've done so far that the past has been horrific and that we as researchers have damaged many of the communities that we now want to extract information from. What I want you to know is that although the past and the history is horrific, what you do today may be worse. Next slide. It is important to recognize that today researchers have not been effective at investing in the communities that they now want to extract information from. I want you to consider the following analogy. Is there anyone in the office, in the room today, who has a relationship with their bank such that they can go to the bank and make a withdrawal without having made a deposit? If, in fact, there is someone in the room who has that capability of extracting before making a deposit, I want you to send me your name, your address, your telephone number, and your email address because I'm coming to hang out with you. It is important to recognize that you cannot and will not effectively extract information from a community before you invest into that community. You cannot expect individuals to engage with you when in fact you have not engaged with them. You cannot expect individuals to say yes and to comply with very complicated protocols for research when in fact you have not engaged them at any time prior to your ask for their participation. It is important that you recognize that there must be a commitment and an engagement with a community before there is an opportunity for you to, in fact, extract information from them. Next slide, please. Subjects often have a lack of information about what we do, and it's because we have not educated them. Words like clinical trials, words like side effects, words like all of the words that we typically use. There is a friend of mine, his name is Melbert. He runs a company known as Metametrics. And the reason, Malbert, is important is the average consent form for participation in a study is written on the 27th grade level. I want you to understand that. I want you to consider your own education. Most of us do not have 27 years of education. What that means is we tend to write at a level that even exceeds our education levels, and we expect our participants to, in fact, understand what we have written. An example of that, you engage a clinical trial on diabetes mellitus, or diabetes insipidus, or type 2 diabetes. And you put up a flyer for most subjects with those words on it. And what you'll find is that none of your subjects respond, in part because none of your subjects have those diseases. Your subjects have sugar. They have sugar problems. That's the word, the nomenclature that they have known diabetes by their entire lives. You run a clinical trial on essential hypertension, and you put up flyers and you advertise for subjects to participate in a trial of essential hypertension. And what you find is that no one in your community has that disorder. And the reason is that they have a disorder called pressure. In the best case, they have something called high blood pressure. In other words, the names and nomenclature that they know their diseases by is different often than what you are asking for. And what that means is that you and I have not made a sufficient capital investment into the community to make sure that they know what we are talking about and that we know what they are talking about. It is of interest to me that the words listen and the words silent have the exact same letters in it. And what I want you to take from that is you have to be silent in order to listen. That sometimes it's okay to ask a question to your patients with the purpose of simply listening to what they have to say, learning about their family dynamic, learning about their transportation, learning about if they ate yesterday, not just the clinical information that we need to collect in that 17 minutes that we are often in the room. Next slide, please. Some solutions, and many conferences and many papers on the topic of recruitment and subject ascertainment focus a lot on what we haven't done and what has not been done and the contamination to the community, but focuses very little on what we can do. And so I hope to spend the rest of my presentation today talking about what we can do. Next slide, please. Early in my career, watching the failure of many of those who I was supervised by, I developed a model known as the Capital Investment Model of Subject Ascertainment, the CIM. It is composed of 3 basic stages: capital preparation, capital recruitment, and capital dissemination. I'd like to talk about all 3 of those for you in my talk today. Next slide. I want you to begin by understanding what a capital investment is. A capital investment is an investment often of time, energy, and money. But there is a risk with a capital investment of not getting an immediate return. And that is what I want you taking in terms of a message from my talk today. I want you to see that often you are required to make capital investments. And that is to say, you will talk to people, you will engage communities, you will give away services in some cases for the purpose of building relationships, not for the purpose of an immediate return, not for the purpose of populating your clinical trial, but for the process of building relationships. Next slide, please. The model, as I noted, has three basic components, and I'd like to start with capital preparation because that is where the largest capital investment occurs. A capital preparation is a period of developing genuine and empathetic relationships with communities that you are a part of. Let me emphasize some components of that statement. It is important to note that when you look, for example, at the psychotherapy literature, there are a couple of factors that tend to predict clinical outcomes more and better than any other outcomes. One is empathy, or the ability to understand suffering and difficulty and circumstances that others find themselves in. The second one is genuineness, being genuinely interested in their outcomes, not for the purpose of what you get, but for the purpose of being genuinely interested in their clinical and other life outcomes. Capital preparation is focused on empathy and genuineness. It is looking at the community of sickle cell patients and asking, when was the last time I did a health fair where I evaluated members of the community, where I got to shake hands and kiss babies, where I was able to engage the community with no clear, immediate return on my investment. Capital preparation is engaging the community, becoming a part of the community, not just driving by. And many of you and I sometimes do drive-by research, and that is research where you pull up to a community and you place your order. You say, I want 160 blacks in a sickle cell trial. I would prefer if 50% of those were male and that the sample was normally distributed on age and other disease-related characteristics. And you expect them just to show up. They do not show up magically. You will not recruit effectively without capital preparations. The next area that I want you to focus on is capital recruitment or participant recruitment. It is important to note that many minority populations and historically disenfranchised populations have community stakeholders and representatives through which you have to go in order to get access to the populations that you want to serve. Notice I didn't say recruit, I said serve. It is important to note that churches and civic organizations and community leaders are often those stakeholders that filter the good from the bad for the community, given many of the atrocities that have occurred. Translated, that means that unless you go through those community stakeholders, you do not really have access to the community. The community will look at you, they will smile, they will listen to you, and they will summarily reject everything you said. With the assistance of those stakeholders, those individuals often will participate. And that is simply to say that rapport is transferable. If you engage the ministerial alliances, if you engage the social organizations, they can transfer some rapport for you and increase the likelihood that subjects are going to say yes. The last area that I want to emphasize, and this is one that I think we do an appalling job on, it's called capital dissemination. And it really is about going back to the community that helped you complete your trial, that assisted you to add lines to your CV or your resume, that assisted the stock price to increase. You go back to those communities and you give them ownership of the process that they help to complete. You tell them the outcomes of the study in language that they understand. In my studies, we often will give, for example, to a church that facilitated subjects to our clinical trials, we will give a plaque or a picture frame that includes a framed picture of the first page of the publication related to the clinical trial that we engaged, and to the side the list of individuals from that particular community or church that participated. What you'll find is that those individuals will stick their chest out, they will raise their head high, and they will begin talking to the community as an emissary for you. They will do what you cannot, and that is they will talk to friends and family when you invest in them and give them ownership of the outcomes that were produced. Next slide. To summarize that model for you, and again, I'm more than happy to talk about it more later, but capital preparation is simply investing back into the community. It means forming genuine and empathetic relationships with the individuals that you need and want one day for your trials. Capital recruitment is simply about going through community stakeholders to make sure that you have rapport not just with individuals, but with those gatekeepers that are there to protect the community. And ultimately, capital dissemination, which is about going back and thanking the populations. Too often we do what I talked about was done in many, many trials, and that is we abandon our subjects when the trial is over. We don't make sure that they have access to the medications that worked for them. I want you to think about it. You take a trial or an experimental medication, and it transforms your life. And so for 6 to 9 months, you are the best that you have been. You can interface with others. You think clearly. You emote clearly. The clinical trial ends, and suddenly everybody goes silent. The medicine that was so productive for you is now taken away from you in a way that makes you feel used and abused, and in many cases worse than before the clinical trial. What that means is that through culture or the intergenerational transmission of information, you'll make sure that your children and your grandchildren don't make the same mistake that you did by participating in a clinical trial. We have to make sure that we take care of the people who take care of us. Next slide. As I come to a close, I provided to the Ascent team 3 empirical papers that cover much of what I have said today, written by our group. There is a book chapter that I provided you on African American health, and at the end of that book chapter is a very sarcastic list of things that you really should not do if you are planning to be an effective recruiter of disenfranchised populations, like patients who have sickle cell disease. In that same sense of sarcasm, I have some tips for recruitment here. I want you to know right from the beginning that this is sarcastic. Do not follow these tips. Do the opposite of these tips. Look at the first one. Rely on your international fame as a researcher. And go out and tell a patient who's suffering with sickle cell disease, I'm Dr. Edwards, and I'm well known in sickle cell, and I need you in my trial, and see if they say yes. They're going to say no. Your fame is great in the office. Your fame is great with other researchers and other docs. It means nothing to a person who is suffering and who does not have money for transportation to get to your trial. Your fame means nothing to a person that has not eaten in 2 days. Your fame means nothing to an individual that does not have child care to participate in your study. You have to understand the subject, not just yourself. Number 2, I wasn't there, so it's not my problem. I never enslaved people. I never hurt people, so it's not my problem. Well, I got news for you. It is your problem. Whether you were there or not, the resolution often falls on you. And that means you have to demonstrate that you're genuine in your interest and that you are willing to serve the communities, not just exploit them. Number 3, my needs are most important. Yeah, well, you can think that, but the subjects will retrain that out of your head really, really quickly. It worked in the past, and it should work for blacks or other disenfranchised populations. And what I want you to know is that's not true. What works for the dominant culture almost never works for the minority culture. We don't need a recruitment strategy. Yes, you do. Plan for your success. Plan how to engage the community. Build it and they will come. Number 8, well, it doesn't work like that. The fact that you are focused on sickle cell disease drug development does not mean that the community is. If the community is suffering with hypertension and having strokes and aneurysm and cardiovascular disease, then they are not going to participate in your trial because your focus does not address their day-to-day problems. So you have to engage the community. We recruit 6 minorities, isn't that enough? Well, there's the idea of representative but insufficient. And all that means is you want a sample that is large enough to have meaning, to have reliability across time. What I want you to know from this list is that there are things that you can do. I hope that you see wrongs that you have done when you read this list. I hope that you never do number 10. Once I get my data, I'm out of here. You can do that, but no one will ever participate in your clinical trials again. You will damage the community for the next group of researchers who are trying to do a good thing for a good reason. Next slide, please. In my conclusion, I did provide a copy, a PDF copy of my presentation to the Ascent team, and what I provided you here are some of the references that I think give what I've said today credibility. 99% of what I have talked about today has been published by our group across the last 20 years or so. And I look forward to working with you in terms of further developing your skills to recruit successfully this clinical trial. Thank you. I'm all done.
Thank you so much, Doctor. It was a little twist to what I heard you last week, but I do hope that you also think that Dr. Edwards gave us some food for thoughts. Dr. Edwards will join us later in the panel discussion, so if you have any questions for him, you're welcome to add it to your iPad or